My name's Lucy Latham. I am an engagement officer at Sustainable Futures, and you will have been receiving my many reminder emails over the previous few weeks. So before I hand over to Professor Mike Shaver, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. Okay, so you may have already seen the toilets. They're next to the front entrance either side. There is no fire alarm planned, so if the alarm does sound, please leave via the nearest exit and head to the assembly point, which you can see on the map. We will be doing some photography, and as you can see, we're also recording, but that's just for the panel. But there will be photographs of the event itself, so if you would like to be excluded from any of those photographs, just come and speak to somebody in a blue t-shirt, or my colleague Alex at the back, who is wielding the camera. And we've got a risk assessment if anybody wishes to see it. And then finally, for those who are registered for the academic workshop with policy at Manchester, just to let you know, the room is G2, which is just near the front, but we'll be around if there's any confusion with that. So, any questions throughout the day, just come to myself, Keiko, Alex, we're here to help. And I hope you enjoy it. So I'll now hand over to Mike for the panel.
Cool, thanks very much. So yeah, welcome everybody. This event is a long time brewing. And that's because a lot of the things that we want to do as a civic university in that policy space actually are really quite complicated. As Director of Sustainable Futures, one of the most complicated things I have done in this entire time in the role is actually getting accredited. And so UNEP is an accrediting body tied to the UN, looking at how environmental and sustainable change can happen, and really the importance of external organizations in helping to shape those narratives. But boy, oh boy, are they archaic. So if you ever are thinking to yourself, oh, the University of Manchester has some really strange administrative systems that are difficult to navigate and interact with, just know it's even more painful elsewhere. But that pain is actually really quite important, because if we want to show leadership, if we want to evidence that the things that we understand are the things that we know how to do, and our knowledge can help shape the world and change the world, it's so important to engage in policy at a local level, at a national level, and at an international level. And equally, the things that are happening in policy at the UN and elsewhere are actually really important to shaping our perspectives on the things that we can do. So our research can inform policy and help enable a sustainable future, but equally policy can really help inform what we do and how we think about these complex and interconnected challenges. So I myself I'm a material science researcher. I kind of fell into some policy work myself in trying to help solve waste management problems. First did that in Greater Manchester, then started to do policy work nationally, and they've even fed into the UN Plastics Treaty negotiations. But I'm kind of doing that without knowing what I'm doing. And so I'm really interested in this panel today to be able to bring people together who actually know what they're doing. So I'm here to learn as well as you're here to learn from three brilliant people. And so just to start things off, we're going to get them to introduce themselves. So I think the first brief is, if you can explain who you are, what your experiences is working at the interface between academic research and sustainability policy, and why you're here today. So Diane, if you want to start.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Diana, sorry.
Oh, sorry, thank you. You can hear me anyway, can't you? But you need this for the filming, etc. Okay, so thank you. I'll try and remember. So I would make 4 points, because I know we've got we were given a great set of questions, so hopefully we'll have a good discussion. I would say I was a reluctant academic. So I didn't really come to academia until my early 40s. My first job, which was very influential to this panel, and its focus on environmental sustainability. So all of my discussions are very much focused on environmental sustainability. So my first job was actually in the Government Economic Service in the Forestry Commission in the 1980s. And it was really when environmental policy landed with the British government, primarily because of the crisis around acid rain. So I worked there as an economist, thinking about issues of conservation and commercial forestry in that context. That was super influential for me. Not long, a few things happened, but about 5 years after that, I was working for a research policy institute based in London, the International Institute for Environment and Development, set up by Barbara Ward to really institutionalise her work on environment and development. Very soon after I started was the Earth Summit of 1992, which was a point at which environment and development groups began to work more strategically together. But at that time, environment policy and programming and practice was on the sidelines of development. IIED's task, in a very real way, was to make it mainstream. The third thing I would highlight is really from that date, the early 90s, I've worked very closely to strengthen citizen groups, residents' associations, a little bit of work on workers' associations in the Global South in the urban context, which is my specialism. And that is related to issues of justice, issues of representation, and also a belief that professionally driven initiatives on policy and programming have failed, so we need to really build up that knowledge at the grassroots. And I would just say finally, through the African Cities Research Consortium, we are undertaking a bunch of action research projects in 5 African cities which have a very core vision to change policy programming and practice, some of which are related to the Brown Agenda, i.e. water, sanitation, drainage, and some related to climate.
So thank you very much. If we can close, as I'm going to get to the beginning, so can you just say, for anyone who is listening to you rather than watching you, and couldn't see the screen, who you are, what your role is.
Yeah, no, I was jumping straight off that. Okay, so my name is Diana Mitlin. I'm Professor of Global Urbanism at the Global Development Institute, and I'm CEO for the FCDO-funded African Cities Research Consortium. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wasundara, next.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Mike.
Bring it closer.
This experience is really nice for me because I'm just starting my academic career, so I'm very honored to be here. So my name is Wasundara. I'm a PhD researcher, second-year PhD researcher from today at Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research over in the other building. So my experience though is in policy. I did my bachelor's in environmental sciences, and then I went to do my master's in Austria in environmental sciences and policy. So I did study policy in this sector and went on to do some internships in places like different private organizations and also at UN Environment Program, which is one of the reasons that I'm in this panel for my expertise. And I also was about my career, I am a policy analyst. I worked with different government departments in the UK and other national governments, and also policy lobbying and advocacy from trade associations perspective. So I can give some experience as an early career researcher now, and how my previous experience as a policy analyst combines with that and helps with that. So a little bit closer to you.
And so why sounds like you were already influencing policy way better than I was, right? So why decide to then come to the University of Manchester and do a PhD?
I did want to work in the industry a little bit before I come back to academia. I do love studying. I know it's very weird to say, but that's where I'm very comfortable in, like doing research, literature reviews. Everyone hates it, but and like policy analysis and everything. So I was like, I always wanted to do a PhD, but I didn't want to just jump into a PhD right after my master's. I want to see what are the areas I'm going to be liking, because a PhD is 3-4 years commitment. I didn't want to be doing something that I hate. So that's the reason I was in the industry, to understand what I want to do for the PhD. So that's why I'm back. I'm very happy here.
Excellent. Thank you for that sales pitch. Matt, you have to sell it better than that.
I think I'm going to be the curmudgeon today, but anyway, we'll see. So yes, I'm Matt Paterson. I'm currently the director of the Sustainable Consumption Institute at Manchester. I've got 9 days of that left. I'm going to hand over to my great colleague Mike Hodson.
You're already dressed for a holiday.
Well, to be fair, anybody who knows me knows that this is that's not a distinction I would wear this to most meetings. I'm also a professor of international politics in the politics department at Manchester, and that's sort of where I would probably start. I'm also actually the deputy director of this new Just Centre that you might have seen that Manchester is the lead institution for, funded by the ESRC. And so I'm a political scientist by training. I did my PhD finished it in 1994, tracking the UNFCCC negotiations. So for me, sustainability policy is first and foremost a field site for research. It's a research object. It's not a thing I ever started thinking, oh, I'm going to shape this in some heroic way. We've all been encouraged to think in slightly more heroic terms about our influence on policy. But for me, I think, and then because climate change was a new issue on the international agenda in the late 80s, early 90s, lots of people who were starting to do research on it were wanting to come to, quote, solutions or policy interventions or design, because that was what was going on and people wanted to do that. And I always had that, and I still have this, is that our first job as academics is to have a diagnosis or an analysis of why things are happening in the ways they're happening. And that's that's why being nerdy and embracing your nerdiness is a really important thing. And so for me, I was always, my PhD was about why did the bargain that got struck in 1992 over climate change, did it take that form? Who won? Who lost? What were the compromises? What were the long-term consequences of the particular designs and the effects that had? And I still think for me, that's if I go to a COP, that's when I went to was in Glasgow, and that was what I went for. I was doing field work. And for me, that's sort of, my sort of first engagement with policy is actually about understanding how it works, not necessarily shaping it. That's the secondary thing. That said, my other main engagement has been through the IPCC. I've been an IPCC lead author and a contributing author on the last 2 reports. I've been...
Do you want to say what that acronym means?
So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so the main science body, UN science body on climate change. That's been a fantastically interesting process. I've learned loads and loads. I think the IPCC has been very influential at some very macro, broad level of keeping the attention, gaining a sense of what the state of existing science is. Whether it's been particularly influential on things like policy design, I would have lots of question marks about, for reasons will probably come up in later questions. So I think I'll maybe leave that hanging and come back to that. Under what conditions do things like the IPCC or the work we do individually have effects, and under what conditions they don't. Right? We should understand that distinction. I'll stop there.
So thank you for all 3 of you for those initial perspectives. And I guess what we're going to now do is to try and dig into some more specific questions on reflecting back on what has happened, but also what may happen in the future. And I think certainly at this university, I started here 7 years ago, and there were people doing policy, and they were separate from the people who were not doing policy, right? And there was a subset enclave. But I think what has happened recently is that policy has started to touch a huge number of different disciplines and become much more important as a way for us to create impact out of our research, right? And so we have academic impact, which is coming from papers and from being able to influence a field. We have industrial impact, which is, I think, also growing in importance here. But then this idea of being a civic responsible university and creating local impacts by working on policy, and then those broader impacts nationally and internationally is sort of now touching in fields which it didn't touch before. And so this idea of the three of you reflecting on where you've come and where you're going is I think, interesting. And so sort of the first formal question, if you will, is how has the sustainability policy field changed recently? And then what do you think the key factors are that will enable or disable policy change? So by policy change, I think we mean for policy to change in the future. Anybody want to start?
I can start.
See, this is what you should do as a PhD student. Volunteer. Take this
This is my year of years, which I'm saying years and volunteering to everything. So anyway, so my PhD is in net zero commitments from cities. So one of the things I can say from that is in the policy field, sustainability, climate and environment is, in the past few years, I think the policies have changed from broad commitments to specific goals. For example, like net zero goals that was made into laws or policies in cities and national governments and etc. And that shift, I think, is one of the main reasons could be the climate emergency that's increasing, where the climate impacts, the frequency and the intensity of them are increasing and growing. We have heat waves in the UK now, so you feel it and you see it. So policymakers can't, and also the governments can't just ignore that. So that is good for the climate change aspect because then the policies and the action is happening. But one of the things I can say is, like, just to conclude my answer is, in my opinion, success of these policies depend on, like you also touched on, interdisciplinary, cross-sector and multi-sector collaboration of academia, policymakers and enforcers, governments, among others. So that's one of the perspectives I can give from my experience from the other side, in lobbying and in non-profits and also from the academia. I'll start off with that, but of course Matt and I can add more.
Can I pick up on one phrase as a point of entry? I think the point you made about heat waves, politicians can't ignore it. I think I fundamentally disagree with that. I think we have good evidence that many of them are in fact ignoring it, right? And so I think that's a really good entry point for me about why understanding the politics of policy is really important, right? And what the key change in the last 5 years, I would say, is that that's become more and more palpable, more and more recognised. I mentioned being involved in the IPCC. I was asked as a lead author to come in as a lead author to the chapter 1 of the policy bit of the report, working group 3, which just deals with policy stuff, because they wanted to reinforce exactly a set of messages and an ability to survey literature about how political dynamics are shaping what can and can't be done, right? And that's become much more sharp, right? And we know that this is not going to be obvious, there's no surprises here, right? At the geopolitical level, a sort of backlash forces in the United States, in most obviously, but also in lots of other countries as well, including in the United Kingdom, becoming much more empowered and much stronger. And it's not like they are, and actually climate denial at the same time, explicit climate denial, saying climate change is not happening, is going down, even by those people. Right? So if you look at what reforms say, they say, we do not believe climate change is a hoax, but we do believe net zero is a hoax. That was in their manifesto in the general election last year. Right? And that's an important shift, I think, in their storylines that tells you something. I think that they are more aggressively anti-climate action at the same time as they're weakening their climate denial, at least in their public rhetoric. But I think it's what we need to think about is to understand when we're trying to make interventions, that any interventions that come out of our expertise are always going to be interacted and be shaped by the prevailing interests, values and power that different actors in that policy process have and what they're trying to achieve. Trying to persuade somebody from reform, actually if you're going to try and persuade somebody, a reform council in Lincolnshire, when they have a terrible harvest at the end of this year, which they're probably already having, might be a quite different sell to a reform council in County Durham, which has been elected with different parts of the reform package, right? Or persuading but I think what it shows really is that the attempt to say we can do this while ignoring power relations and pretend that it's all good for everybody actually doesn't work. And the last 5 years have shown us that quite decisively, and that we need to sort of really understand how our interventions interact with those political dynamics and those power relations.
So do you think there is the dichotomous dynamic that you're suggesting, right, where there is a greater split between beliefs? Do you think that has come because of the specificity that you've raised, right? So like we've been getting more specific about what we think environmentally sustainable policies look like, and therefore there is a reaction to it because it was so vague before that you could ignore it? Is that a reason why?
I think that's part of it. I mean, if you look at the simple crudeness of the UK system, and climate, I'll stick to climate because it's what I know, that 60 to 70% of the cuts in emissions in Britain have come from getting rid of coal and electricity. And so that was a political struggle that happened in the 1980s, before climate was on the agenda. It actually had other reasons to want to destroy the National Union of Mine Workers, and that actually is really important to why UK looks actually rather good on climate, paradoxically. But now we've exhausted that possibility. Now we're having to do things like decarbonise home heat, fully shift to electric vehicles, etc. People raising the questions of meat and dairy, all the rest of it. So there's lots new types of struggles that those things, and the reform have actually been very good at picking up on those. And they're harder to fudge.
Diane.
So, those of you listening carefully to my first intervention will have perhaps noticed that policy really didn't figure very highly in it. What figured highly was around learning, around evidence creation, around building an understanding between competing groups, i.e. building coalitions of action, and building capabilities among those excluded and disadvantaged to participate. So I think that's really where I would start in answering the question, how has sustainability policy field changed, and what factors are enabling and disenabling policy change. So a little bit picking up on that, for me, there are always 4 Ps. Absolutely, politics is central. Policy is important, but not very important. Programming, i.e. what are people actually doing to take policies into action, and practice. The whole range of formal and informal beliefs and activities that influence how policy, programming, and politics land on the ground. So I think for me, you really have got to broaden out an understanding about how policy makes a difference. I work primarily with the people living and working informally in cities of the global south. That is at least 1 in 7 of the global population. It is a huge group. It is a neglected group. People don't want to deal with it because it is so hard. Now, looking a little bit at the question, what's changed? I would say the big changes are perhaps not related to sustainability policy as such, but actually a bit related to what the state is doing in terms of service provision and what the market is doing. So if I wander into an informal settlement now, I will certainly see some level of recycling activities because there's a market in recycling. You go back 30 years, that just did not exist. People were not doing it. I think just perhaps to reflect on the current moment, I think it's a really difficult moment. I think there was always a bunch of people who were super sceptical about international policy and national policy, and that has grown. It's like, why are we going to these global events? What do they do? And they don't do much. I think there are big constraints around the personal action people can take. I think a lot of people have a commitment, but a lot of people feel the problem is now so huge that there's nothing they can do. So they're waiting for the state, and the state, perhaps for reasons that Matt just suggested, is not acting. It's really not acting in most countries of the world, and once it does act, it generally acts ineffectively. And thirdly, I think there is for most of the people I work with a crisis of development. I mean, they will talk about how expensive food has got. They will talk about the fact there's no water. The water is often never flowed in pipes, and it still doesn't flow in pipes. So, these kinds of real-world impacts around an economic and developmental crisis will probably be where most of the people I work with, this 1 in 7 to 1 in 5 of the global population, that is their crisis. And it's a long way from sustainability policy.
but it's intertwined with it because there are consequences on the things that we do, right? And because it is such a messy problem, that means, to come back to your point on interdisciplinarity, right? Like, there isn't a single discipline that can actually provide the evidence base that is needed to inform the 4 Ps, right? It actually makes that ever more complex, but also ever more important that universities, as big and complicated and messy as the University of Manchester, get engaged with it. So I think that's interesting. I naively or otherwise, I became an academic because I thought I could change things, right? And sometimes that's like, oh, I could change a person's life by teaching them or mentoring them in their PhD, or I could change industry. And I have found it really difficult myself to like change things in the policy landscape because it almost feels intractable. So if change is a goal, if we want to have a delta of improvement in some way, how does change happen? How do we actually get change?
So maybe I should start, because as I said, I'm a reluctant academic, but really from the point of my time in the UK civil service, I became convinced about the value of academia. I just had to kind of work my way back slowly. So the substantive changes I have observed in the UK, but also more in the global south, involve a conflation of 3 things, and all 3 have to be in place. It doesn't necessarily change when all 3 are in place. So firstly, there needs to be serious sustained pressure from below, and that pressure has to be more than just, this is a problem to be addressed. It has to also involve, and this is the way we think that problem can be addressed based on our experience. So you need super well-informed grassroots organisations. You need evidence that will convince elites that if they change, they will still be able to protect their interests and they won't be seen to fail. So a crisis will get elites to respond, political elites, but they won't necessarily respond in the way that you want, and they won't necessarily respond in a way that is constructive. Thirdly, and academia is important, particularly for the second one, provision of evidence. It is super critical in the third one. You need a state that has capable officials that understand the problem and solution because they have been well educated. And the value of having mid to top level officials who understand the importance of the processes of reform they're involved in, who set up feedback loops so they see the outcomes of their efforts and revise the policy programming and practice based on that is critical. So hence, for me, places in academia are really important to use knowledge to disrupt things that are not working well, but also to recreate, reconstitute, and plan for knowledge and evidence to land in a way that contributes to positive change.
So I guess academia is providing evidence in terms of public engagement as well on that bottom piece where they're influencing up, as well as then providing evidence at that top level as well. Interesting.
So they would do that, but they also need a sophisticated engagement with grassroots communities.
Yeah.
Grassroots communities have rightly become super suspicious of experts because experts have been involved both in efforts that have dispossessed them, have removed them, have excluded them, but even when they're well-intentioned, let's be frank, we often fail. But it does not have to be that way. We have a myriad of examples of where academics have worked differently with grassroots organisations, have legitimated and supported their inclusion in policy programming, practice redesign, and then they see the value. Not just in academics helping to convene spaces, but also having useful theories, concepts, and helping them solve problems. So there is a way forward. We just don't invest in it enough.
I would echo loads of what Diana just said. I think one implication I would pick up from it is to say that if the people in the room are thinking, okay, how would I influence policy, then it might be that you start by ignoring government departments and actually just go and finding the NGOs or the community groups or whoever it was. for whom the evidence, or the other way of asking it is, for whom is the evidence that you will be creating useful? And have a model of the policy world, maybe, but if the policy world, as Diana suggested, one of the ways that change in that policy happens in some big scale change. There's tiny tinkering, and then there's bigger scale change, which I think probably most people in the room recognise we need. Then that happens because of forms of political pressure, not from expertise or the two articulating with each other. Then it may be, our expertise may be just as much useful in helping that political pressure work effectively than directly saying, getting the ear of the minister or the ear of the person advising the minister. Right? That feels like it's a really useful thing to take away, I think. The other thing I was going to say, and I'm sorry, I'm rely on my computer for those, is I think we also need to recognise that lots of change takes enormous amounts of time. Right? It's the usual truism in studies of socio-technical transitions that lots of sustainability work relies on, is that a big scale change in some socio-technical system takes 50 to 70 years. Right? The automobile becoming the dominant transport system across the global north took between about 1890 and about 1950 in most countries in Europe and North America. That's the sort of timescale those technical changes and that sort of sense of time frame is replicated in lots of other fields. Very few examples of where it changes very quickly. The daily habits, the question of what can I do in my daily life, those typically take 10 to 20 years to shift. Right? There's lots of good studies of that ilk as well. Large-scale social systems, let's use the word capitalism, that took 500 years to establish as a global system, if we think it's a useful way of characterising the global economy that we live in. That took from sometime in the 15th century to now to establish globally. So some of those things take enormous amounts of time to change. They change by some of those mechanisms that Diana alluded to. But some things change quickly. And thinking about crises, of which we've had many in the last 5 years, is actually, I think, a useful way to think that, because those are moments where openings occur, power relations become a bit unclear. It can go both ways. It can get worse as well as better. We usually tend to assume that crises make things worse, but we can think of lots of ways of the recent crises where it's enabled some of those coalitions to come around. And if you think about what I was saying about the backlash, think about reform in the UK, it's really weird. The best thing for lots of people who voted reform will be really good housing retrofit. That's a really good way of making their lives better if we can do it. The question of how we do it and how that articulates with other sorts of interests and power relations and so on, and the technologies. But there's lots of messiness in a crisis that create possibilities for change for the move. But it would still happen, I think, primarily through political pressure, where academic expertise is a sort of secondary question, I think, that we can attend to.
We've got Matt's ambition, so he wants to change capitalism.
I bet I'm not the only person in the room who thinks that. But the point I would always say, and I've written a book called Climate Capitalism, which is about how
I was doing a
segue. It's 15 years old now.
To get a few more sales.
But it's this is a marketing exercise. Everybody else does something. But the question in that book is if we imagine that capitalism is a sort of organising logic for our global economy, how might it plausibly decarbonise? Not whether it is in fact. We can see that there's weak evidence for decarbonisation in different places in the world. It's sometimes better in some places and worse in others, but it's always globally integrated. But there is a premise there, which is the 500-year premise, right?
And you can read more in your book.
There's not much I can add here, and I agree. In an ideal world, the change happens, I think, in that sweet spot between scientific evidence, practical solution, and political momentum. To summarize the answers, from my perspective as an academic, early career academic, I'll tell you some of my experiences when you're trying to do change or create change and dealing with policymakers. Your academic knowledge needs to be translated into a language that policymakers understand. And your journal article will not be read by policymakers I'm sorry. You need to use the information in a way that they understand that, okay, this is the problem, this is the solution that the academics are proposing, this is the data to support that this much, how much money you are saving, how much emission reductions you're going to do through that solution, and etc., etc. And the core benefits for different sectors. That's how you have to tell them to understand what you're doing, and that's how you should share your knowledge. Because I've written countless answers to consultations where I had the knowledge, I had the evidence, but I needed to rework that, revise and rewrite that in a way that it's usable for policymakers. So my suggestion in that aspect is you have to sort of touch up on the communication and translating your knowledge into policymakers' language. So I know that's a bit of a tangent,
No,
but
that's what I would have answered. So yeah, that's good.
yeah.
Yeah, so I think that like there are layers to this. There's really big picture, right? Opportunities for change. There are ways to interact with lots of different groups empathetically to enact change, and then there's that really specific. You need to probably write whatever it is you wanted to write 5 different times for 5 different audiences to make sure, because to convince the NGO that your evidence is, that's a different thing than your policy document as well. So if we can just move, yeah, but feel free to do callbacks, as we say in the comedy industry. So if those are the opportunities, then what are the limits? What are the challenges? So what do you think the biggest barriers are if we as a university want to see our research and teaching create change? What are the barriers that we face?
So consistent with what I've said before, I would say one of the biggest barriers we face is a failure to understand that you need everything aligned. That the most brilliant academic evidence in the world does not change anything. It gets used to defend a political position that you do not agree with, and that is very frequent. But to actually change things requires us to work in very different ways. And I just really wanted to just dwell a little bit. You talked about a crisis as being of opportunity as well as potentially problematic. I would absolutely agree with that. Crises shape things. And if you are ready, then they are opportunities. So just maybe to give a somewhat prosaic example from some work we're doing in Accra. And the Accra Action Research team we're working with is developing a solution of women's-led organic waste cooperatives. Broadly, in a big informal settlement called Fadama, big problems of flooding, big market, the organic waste is not being dealt with, the women have obviously livelihood needs, the city council is super motivated around waste management, and there are obviously benefits on the organic composting. Now, they know that if successful, they will challenge the very powerful position of a big corporate agency called Zoomlion. So they're kind of getting all their ducks lined up around the composting techniques, the social organisation, the marketing, etc. But that's where they're heading. Now they absolutely now have an opportunity because completely unconnected with their project, Zoomlion has come under a lot of criticism for paying for a youth employment scheme that they paid the youth very badly. So suddenly there's a whole bunch of critiques coming out around their corporate target. So obviously now this has presented them with more of an opportunity that they will be planning to take advantage of. That involves academic knowledge, but academic knowledge is quite clearly aligned to a whole bunch of things going on the ground. That academic knowledge is diverse, going back to your multidisciplinary emphasis. It's the techniques of organic waste composting. It's the social organisation of how you can link to farmer organisations, how you can sell things at scale, a whole bunch of business type expertise. And it is politics. Can you work out how to follow this strategy successfully, or will they blindside you? Will they be planning to close you down because they're disrupting, for example, customary leaders that control old Fadama?
One of the things I can say is to add to some of the conversations we had today, and the climate denial perspective is one of the challenges is we still, as sustainability, environment and climate researchers in 2025, is we still have to convince people in power in different sectors that this is real and we need to address it right now and the time is running out. And as researchers, that's a challenge that you will come across. That's a challenge you will come across in years to come. So you have to sort of understand how to not be offended with it and not take it personal and communicate it in a way that people will understand. And even if they don't believe in what your research is, what your knowledge and what your evidence is, that the wider organization will take action. And that also going back to the market failures and capitalism and behavior change questions, that takes time, like you said. And that's one of the challenges academics we have, is to create change we have to be patient, because the evidence shows that we don't have time, but we have to be patient while the change happens and accept the fact that it could take time. And one last point is, my 3 points are not connected probably, so just please be patient. The other one I wanted to say is, for example, when you're working with government departments as an academic, sometimes they would consult with universities and academic institutions and ask you to do, we have this problem, please give us some recommendations based on scientific evidence. And then you as academics go back to the drawing table, you do this research and everything, literature reviews and data analysis, modeling, and then you come up with a set of recommendations. And then you present it to the government department or the organization that asks you to do it. And they're like, this is good work, but our priorities are this and your evidence doesn't go along with it. So I want you to change your evidence. As academics, we can't do that because evidence cannot be changed to match the priority of the government department or the government organization. So one of the things you have to take into consideration when you are working with policymakers or anything related to policies, is the priorities of different sectors, different organizations, and you as academic is different. And aligning that to create a shared change or long-lasting transformation is tricky. It's going to be tricky. So I'm not saying that to sort of discourage you, but that is, I'm sure all the academics here, everyone who has been doing this will agree, that is a challenge that we have to overcome every day.
So be patient and don't take it personally.
Yes.
Okay, Matt, quickly, please.
Yeah, two points. One is that the limits of policy at a level of the technical design of a policy never quite achieves the effects it's going to do, for a variety of reasons that it's claimed for it. And there are a variety of reasons to do with that. Sometimes it's because there are long-term change processes that generate growth that undermine a strategy that's designed to increase the efficiency of the system, but the system's growing too fast for it to keep up. Or there's because it's a single policy that's been introduced, but you actually need multiple interventions in different sites in an integrated way, and they don't do that for a variety of reasons. So I think there's that, thinking about the limits of policy and then thinking of what that means for us in terms of types of evidence we might want to create. The second one, I think, is that we live in a world, limit this to global north context that I know better, Diana's talked much better about the global south context, is that we live in a world where policy is self-limited. Policymakers are limiting themselves. They are deliberately constraining themselves to a constrained set of options. The current debates in the water in the UK, which again, Diana knows loads about, is a really good example. There's tremendous popular support for taking water back into public ownership, and it would structurally change a whole set of things in terms of what can be achieved in terms of water conservation, water purity, etc., etc. It is off the table for a range of political reasons and ideological reasons that even an ostensibly centre-left government doesn't want to entertain. So there's that macro scale of ways in which big political structures, and I would say back to the one codicil to that on the multidisciplinary point, part of that is because economists are too powerful. Apologies in to economists in the room, they have occupied too much of the policy space. So, for example, you get a sense of, the first question is always how much will it cost to GDP, or how much will it cost to investment in the British economy, or etc., etc. And that radically shrinks the space of what is imagined as possible.
Are there any economists here?
Not all economists are bad.
I talked to it.
Just the ultra neoclassical ones.
I talked
the
to,
early worlds, yeah.
well, either of the economists may be able to figure out who this is, so I'll keep it vague. But I talked to an economist here at the University of Manchester who said, economics is already interdisciplinary, so we don't have to work with any other disciplines.
I mean, one of the nice things about being at Manchester is actually that economics is not central to the debates about sustainability. I worked in Canada for a long time where they had all the occupation was about, was in macroeconomic models, and they were determined, and everybody else had to talk around the edges of that.
Okay, so we're over time, but I'm going to ask this last question from me before we open it up to them. And all we're doing is delaying lunch, so keeping our carbon footprint down by not eating. Matt, in a single sentence, but right?
Yeah.
So if we want more people to be doing this policy stuff, we want to work together as one Manchester to accelerate change, what is something that we as a university could do, or as an individual who's in this room can do? What's the one thing that you think can change as we move into our Manchester 2035 strategy and our One Manchester vision?
I think go back to think who the audience is. Who is it that we are trying to speak to? And what are their stakes, and how can we generate evidence that helps them do the work they want to do? And that may not be, that following Diana's logic earlier on, that may not start with policymakers per se, but actually people who themselves have more capacity to change policy systems.
Know your audience. Good.
I'll say something very millennial and Gen Z. Your knowledge has to be disseminated, so use your social media platforms to get your knowledge out so that it can help at least change the behavior of at least one single person, and that's still a change that you can create. So use not Twitter, but Blue Sky and maybe LinkedIn. And again, keep my previous suggestion in mind and write your evidence in an understandable language. So that's my one sentence.
Broadcast what you know.
So I would say highlight two things on the assumption you care deeply about environmental sustainability. So firstly, I'm working now with people I've been working with for 30 plus years. That creates opportunities. Think about building your relational capital. That is absolutely critical. Second is really going back to one of the earlier themes. If you are successful, you will get so far and then you will fail. You cannot take on the change that is needed without provoking a strong resistance. You have to be ready for that failure. You have to be ready to absorb the failure, to plateau and go forward. If you are overwhelmed by the idea that you will fail, you are no good to the ambitions that you seek to nurture, because others are in a much more vulnerable position and you need to protect them. So prepare for the struggle ahead.
Failure is awesome. So, 3 fantastic lessons, but before we go to lunch, we have some time for your questions. So, thinking about what you've heard today, or things that you've already been thinking about in your own policy spaces, do you have any questions for our esteemed panel? At the back, please.
Hiya, thanks for the panel. I have a question about...
Can you tell us who you are?
Hi, I'm Corinne Hatton. I'm in the chemistry department, finishing my PhD. We've seen a lot of greenwashing of companies and then also a focus on personal carbon footprints. How do you think this affects global sustainability policy?
I think I might be the greenwashing guy.
Carbon footprint.
I mean, as soon as environmental sustainability became something you could market, companies started to greenwash because they realized that they could sell products and systems or brand recognition through that. And actually, I think that academic evidence in my sector, which is probably closest to the chemistry piece, that is becoming probably the biggest area of where our academic expertise is informing policy. So how do you build policies which don't allow people to just write whatever they want in terms of their green claims? That of course extends not wanting people to understand the truth behind whatever it is they're doing, also sort of extends to the offloading of responsibility onto individuals. Because you're saying, well, you could have bought this thing which was green and you didn't, and it's not even green. And so it creates this sort of cycle between industry not really wanting to take true responsibility of their footprint, so they're using greenwashing, but then they're also saying individuals should be taking responsibility in terms of personal carbon footprints or personal environmental impact footprints, because we're well beyond carbon. Next. So in the blue t-shirt there.
Hi. There's a lot of commentary on evidence-based policymaking. I wanted to just slightly provocatively ask, is there any evidence that policymaking is informed by evidence? Insofar that many politicians in particular seem to, if the evidence presented to them aligns with what they think already, then they'll use it, and if it doesn't, they'll ignore it. And so I guess the broader question coming from this is, alongside the actual kind of rational evidence that we might be needing to develop, is there also a kind of hearts and minds piece here? Is there the sort of aesthetics of politics, if you like, where does that come into this? Is a question.
I would always, when I get asked about evidence-based policymaking in those interdisciplinary contexts, you do it in the IPCC, for example, I'd always return and say, well, we also have evidence about how policy works, right? So we can have an evidence base of how politicians and policymakers make their decisions, and that then would become my starting point, which is I think the premise for your question, and then I think it's back to saying. So I think, yes, for the most part, if you go and do a DESNES consultative meeting and you're putting evidence in, it will be completely filtered through an already existing set of priorities and values. So at the moment, for example, IPPR are leading a process of putting in stuff on cost of living crisis stuff, and you might have seen something in the paper this morning about Labour MPs putting pressure on the government on that. That's connected to IPPR. And a bunch of academics are involved in that. It's already exactly decided agenda. You have to articulate all your net zero decarbonisation stuff to how do we bring the bells down in a short period of time. Right? So I think you're engaging in that, and that's because we can say we know at that level, but then there is the level of, of what the immediate policy-making decision, but then there's the broader thing of how do we shape the environment in which policymakers are, the things to which policymakers are having to react. Pressures that are upon them. And I think that's back to the point about that Diana really started about coalitions and pressure and so on. And that, I think, is a much more fruitful way where you can sit there and say, if I can build relationships over long periods of time with people who are actually able to articulate that, then that might be a much more fruitful response to that thing about evidence-based policy making.
Diana, you had a point?
Yeah, I wanted just to connect the two with an example from Namibia. So the greenwashing issue for me is a real example where critical academics can shake an understanding and move a debate forward. So proving, for example, that something is greenwashing and not having the effect that you want to creates the space. Whether that company does or doesn't respond positively is what it is. So if you look at what's happened to played out in housing policy in Namibia, there was a whole set of not very successful policies. And one of them was essentially a policy that built medium rise with a lot of finance, corrupt finance going to benefit politicians. Now, the critique of that has created an alternative space which movements and NGOs and academics have used to now drive forward informal settlement upgrading. When politicians are pushed to respond, they need evidence to take a particular line because they do not want to be seen to fail. In this case, there was really a coalition of knowledge providers that persuaded the government that upgrading would work based on evidence, evidential case studies, and examples they could see in their country. So the fact that not all evidence is taken up or some of it is abused does not mean that it's not important. It's just the placement of it is critical. Oh.
Just sharing that.
Sure, right there.
Great. Hi, my name is Edwin Kwege. I'm a PhD student at GDI. So prior to my PhD, I was mostly in the civil society NGO space in Nairobi. And increasingly in that space, there's a whole lot of getting NGOs doing research with the aim of uptake. And from that reflection, and also a confession, I know very little about the policy space in the UK. But the question I want to ask is, I bet there are universities that are having similar conversations all across the UK about how to get their evidence-based policy making and to have evidence uptaken. In my experience, I've seen there's a whole lot of research waste, in the sense that my university wants to be the one that informed, for example, Labour government policy on climate action. But by the time, I suppose, you're lobbying and getting your knowledge products out there, I suppose there are 200 policy statements or policy briefs being presented to the Labour cabinet secretary or minister or whatever. How do you make sense of that fragmented way of working, and also the idea of working in crisis or the Overton window? How do you justify the downtimes? What do you do in the downtimes when there's no crisis or there's no election or change of regime? What do knowledge workers get to do in those times to prepare for a crisis or an election?
I think Diana had brought up earlier that you need to be ready when the crisis happens. So you can't start doing stuff when the crisis hits. You actually need to build up your evidence and think about how that message is going to be different as you're in the downtimes in between crises. I will say, I actually think that in the UK, there is an exceptional level of collaboration on trying to shape policy. So like all of the stuff that I do is in plastics policy. And if I'm doing a brief into DEFRA, I will have shared my brief and I will have read the briefs of 10 other academics to actually try and reiterate the message. I always say, like, an MP doesn't listen, but an MP does listen if they've heard the same thing 10 times, right? And there is a reiteration of the message with NGOs and with other academics that I think happens here, at least in my field, which didn't happen back in Canada.
I was just going to say on the crisis, on the planning for crises things, I think it's quite well, and I think we've been really bad at this. This is a mere culpa for social scientists mostly. If you like, think of a typology of crises. In the last 5 years, we've had a really good little living lab of two major wars. Well, a major war and an invasion is not really a war because it's so one-sided. A pandemic. And the return of inflation to major economies that it had not seen for 40 years. 10 years prior to that, we had a massive financial crisis, right, to do with subprime mortgages and deregulated financial markets. So we can actually think that they've got different logics, different things you can plan for, and how would you respond, right? If you're going to have another set of lockdowns because of a pandemic like COVID, then we had good ideas quite quickly, but the window shut too quickly. We know exactly how those could be used to reshape transport networks, for example, to rebuild. What the phrase was, build back better, but we were doing it on the hoof. We could plan for that. Right. Financial crisis is a different logic. A war is a different logic. And so I think there's different things that could be thought about to plan ahead. I think if we're going to get to net zero or decarbonisation or whatever we call it by 2050 or shortly thereafterwards, that's 30 odd years. How many of those crises we're going to have? We're going to have about one every 3 years, let's say. right? Of different types, right? They're going to come thick and fast. So actually, it could be a very useful exercise, I think, that planning exercise.
I have some sad news for you all. We're out of time. But fortunately, what we have upcoming is lunch. And lunch is good for two reasons. The first is that it's lunch, clearly. The second is that there will be an opportunity for you to chat with our panelists and ask those questions that we still have. But more importantly, connect with other people who are here, understand what they may know or not know, because that building of relationships really to go and create value out of this environmental sustainability policy interface is going to happen now. So please join me in thanking all of our panelists and